Well, thank you for that. And I am really delighted to be with you all for the relaunch of the Henry Hawkins Lectures hosted by Together for Mental Wellbeing. Well, this is Henry Hawkins. This is Henry Hawkins. Now, Henry was a reverend and the founder of Together for Mental Wellbeing, for Together for Mental Wellbeing in 1879. And he was a humble visionary of his time, and he developed community care, as you've heard, for people leaving asylums, and particularly women. And by all accounts, he was a humane and compassionate man, and he worked in asylums as a chaplain. So why am I going to talk to you about the corridors of powerlessness and hope? Well, let's start in one of the places where Henry worked. This is Colney Hatch Asylum. It was a grand building, and it was said to have the longest corridor in Europe at the time. And it's said that it could take 5 hours to walk around the hospital and visit every ward with its 2,700 beds. So whilst also being an advocate and an innovator of community care, Henry actually continued to work in institutions for the duration of his ministry. And he was a figure of hope, as we've heard, walking along those corridors, meeting the patients and opening up a passage for some people back into the community. But whilst there was hope and refuge for some, we know that others experienced these institutions as oppressive and walked those corridors in powerlessness. And we know that these grand utopian ideals and notions of civic and moral good that some intended led to abuses and unwarranted detention. And we know that the history of asylums and institutions, unfortunately, there's also been a history of abuse and scandals and silencing and shame in the treatment and labelling, and these are difficult things to hear as we know those historic labels: the lunatics, the hysterics, the feeble-minded, the mentally deficient, and the criminally insane. So I'm not here to present a sentimental and sanitised view of asylums and institutions, and we're not free of abuses, unfortunately, today. We can bring to mind those ones that have been exposed in the media. A bit like Henry, I've also worked with people in hospitals for many, many years, not as a chaplain, but as an art therapist. So this is where we're going to leave Henry's story, and I'd like to take you down some of those hospital corridors that I've walked myself. So just for the next 25 minutes, I'm going to think with you, we're going to think together about art and mental health. And I'd like to share with you some of those moments that I've spent with people. Now, people have also been given labels of mental health difficulties and learning disabilities, and people with autism, and people who've arrived in a secure hospital through their contact with the criminal justice system. And I've been with people in moments of their distress and loss and hopelessness, sitting alongside people with something that could be seen as a little bit odd in those moments in hospital. It's often just me and them and a bunch of art materials next to us. And I want to tell you 3 stories about 3 people in 3 places. And I want to tell you 3 things about art and mental health. That art speaks to silence. That art speaks to shared experience. And how art speaks to self. This was the corridor of the Beechcroft Unit, a hospital in Rotherham. And this was the place where I had my first job as an art therapist 24 years ago. So what is an art therapist? Well, art therapists are trained to use creative approaches within psychotherapy and recovery, and to help people with exploring and communicating in creative ways that place less of a burden on talking. But something is created that can be spoken about. And I would say to you that using the arts and creativity within our psychological approaches and recovery can make therapies accessible for many more people. So in the Beechcroft unit, along this sloping corridor, at the top actually, there were the wards. And when the Beechcroft unit was built in 1974, it was a modern institution. It had innovative nursing staff, psychologists, psychiatry input. And although they admitted 150 children with learning disabilities from Rotherham and Doncaster, it was not intended to be a long-stay hospital. It was conceived as a centre to provide expertise and advice. But by the time I arrived to work there in the early 2000s, at the top of that corridor, some of those children were still there. And they'd grown up to be adults who had now got that label, challenging behaviour. And it did become a long-stay hospital. The personal care department. This is where my first art therapy room was, in the Beechcroft unit. It was a vacant room. It wasn't used anymore. For those patients whose home was the hospital, it had been the personal care department, a place to get your hair cut, a salon in an institution. And to turn it into an art therapy room, the hospital works department, the estates came, and they had the task of removing the hairdressing sinks and the mirrors and the shower and all the necessary equipment you needed in a personal care department. And I took this sign off the door and I put it on my desk in every place I've worked. And it reminds me, and it challenges me. And I remember those people who grew up in hospital and went to the salon in the institution, the personal care department. But it also reminds me that this personal care department became the art therapy room, and that times could change and things could change. And people from the hospital came to see me, and people who lived in the community came to see me. And we did art therapy. And so I saw lots and lots of people, but I want to tell you this evening about Mary. So Mary was in her 40s, and she had a learning disability, and she had no speech. She didn't speak. She sort of mumbled and muttered to herself, but she was inaudible to me. But I did observe that she was very intentional and purposeful in the way she acted. So Mary came into the art therapy room, and I remember she had a lovely hat on, and it was sort of woolen woven hat with a rim, and she had quite a long woolen coat. And she took her coat off and she placed it on the back of the chair, and she placed her hat on the table, and I invited her to sit down. And I put some art materials, pens and pencils, in between us on the table, and we looked at each other, and I spoke to her. And Mary didn't make any art, and she didn't pick up any of the art materials. And I consciously stopped myself from doing that sort of panicked thing where if people aren't responding to you, you think, well, I'll offer them something else and I'll give them another suggestion and they can have another choice in the hope that they'll do something. Anything at all would be great to fill the space. But actually, I didn't do that. So we ended up not doing very much. But we sat together and I spoke to her. So the next time Mary came, rather than putting pens and paper on the table, I brought out some clay. And it was just the air-drying clay, not the stuff that you need to put in a kiln. And there was a ball of clay in front of her. And Mary was inquisitive, and she picked it up. And she started to move it around in her hands. And Mary took that clay, and with her thumb, she pressed that clay on the table. And when she lifted up her hands, I could see that she'd made the shape of a person with those pressed out pieces of clay on the table. There was a head, and there was 2 arms and legs and a body. And she carried on. And she made 5 people. And I knew a little bit about Mary because I'd spoken to Mary's sister. I knew she had 5 people in her family. But the reason Mary had come to see me was because her elderly mum was really unwell. In fact, she was terminally ill. And Mary had lived at home with her mother for all of her childhood and for all of her adult life. Because, parents in Rotherham, parents with a learning disability, told me that when they went for expertise and advice, some of them were told, well, leave your child with us and you won't need to worry about them again. But if you take them home, don't come back. So that's what happened sometimes. People managed. And it was at a point when their elderly parents became ill that people then came into contact with learning disability services. So Mary's mum was gravely ill, and her sister was obviously very concerned. And she was asking me, this is Mary's sister, was asking me about what should happen if Mary goes to the funeral. And because Mary had showed me her family in these 5 figures, we started to have a conversation about it. Well, I say a conversation, we started to use the picture cards, and Mary could point to things, and that was great. It worked really well. It opened up a whole level of communication, and she started drawing pictures in art therapy. So when Mary's sister asked me, well, Mary's going to the funeral, what should we do? I said something quite odd. I said something outside of the cultural norms. I said, why don't you take photos at the funeral? And then when Mary's feeling sad about her mum, she can let people know by pointing at the photo. And that's what Mary's sister did. And Mary did show me the pictures from her mum's funeral when she was feeling sad. So I said my first point was going to be about art and mental health. And it is that art speaks to silence. Mary didn't have a voice, but I've also worked with many other people who could say things, but creatively they could communicate things they couldn't say in their own words. Art speaks to silence. So this is Prudder Hospital. It was originally called Prudder Colony, and it's up in the northeast of England, or it was. And this is where I came to work after the Beechcroft unit closed. And you'll be pleased to know that those people who were living on those wards did eventually move into their own homes in the community. So Prudder Colony was established in 1914 as a result of the Poor Laws. It was based around a grand country house, complete with a Victorian walled garden, and it had a renaissance after 1948. It was included in the NHS. And then again in the 1960s, it was extended to include a residential school, so that the whole site was spread across 100 acres. Well, when I arrived in 2004, it was dilapidated, and the school had been closed, and most of the people, mainly people with learning disabilities, had been moved into the community. But there were still young people and adults in the hospital. The wards were called villas, And although the inside were refurbished, some of the original colony buildings were still in use. In fact, some of the time, my own art therapy team was based in a villa. So why were there arts therapists here? Why was there a whole team of arts therapists, art, drama, music, dance, movement therapists? Well, you might be surprised to learn that it was because of the hospital chaplain. The hospital chaplain, the Reverend Mike Wheelwright, he was on the hospital board of governors and discovered music therapy. And he could see how people engaged and changed and how music therapy was transformative, and when they could sing and when they could play an instrument and when they could make a noise. So he proposed to the Board of Governors to change the vacant nursing posts into arts therapy posts. And that's what happened, and there was a large team, and the Hospital Trust paid for people to be trained as arts therapists, and artists and musicians were invited to come to work in the hospital. And the ethos of those artists and therapists was that everyone could take part, everyone could participate in the creation of something collective. And that's the reason that I have a team today of arts psychotherapists working in Cumbria, Northumberland, Tyne and Wear NHS Trust up in the north, east and west. Because of a hospital chaplain who thought differently from the predominant medical model of the time, a bit like Henry did. So I worked with the last person to leave Prado Hospital. They closed the wards, and I'm not sad about that, and people went to live in their own homes. But one person was there for what seemed like a long time after everybody else, and I'll call him Peter. And he had autism, and he had high levels of anxiety and distress, and he would sometimes bang his head. And there were 3 staff available on the ward if that happened, and he lived in one of those villas. So I walked into this huge communal living room, and in one corner, Peter was sat behind a table, and the staff was sat in a sofa in the middle of the room. And I would go every week with my piece of paper and my pens and my pastels, and I would put it on the table in front of Peter, and I would sit and I would talk to him. And Peter picked up the pastels and he drew on his side of the paper, on his side of the table. And I would pick up a similar colour and draw on my side of the table, on my side of the paper. And I would mirror him, not exactly, but I would follow his gestures and his marks, and we'd collectively create art, and a shared art. And he was the leader and I was the follower. And then occasionally it would switch and he would follow me. And I kept coming back to see Peter and talk to him and mirror his art making until he left and went to his own home with a team of people he'd gotten to know well before he moved. So we made some rich and colourful pictures together. But, you know, I think the value of our meeting was that Peter did not get anxious during those times. He did not pose any threat to himself or to me as I sat opposite him. The staff sitting on the sofa in the room, ready to get up and restrain him if he got distressed, that's what they'd been told to do. That wasn't needed. In those moments of shared experience, it was never required. And we also know from research, some of which I've conducted, some of which other colleagues have conducted, that group arts therapies, music therapy included, offer people a real experience, a shared experience that they really value. So my second point is that art speaks to shared experience. This is the Sycamore unit. It's an architectural representation of it. It's not open yet. It will open next month. It's a new, secure hospital for people who have mental health difficulties and learning disabilities, who's come through the courts and the criminal justice system or from prison. And the design of this new unit is based around access to art and nature. There's a central courtyard which is accessible and it's landscaped, and it even has a running track around. And its carefully curated artwork is included depicting Northumberland landmarks. They're colour-coded to help people navigate around the building. And yes, it does have an interconnecting internal corridor going all the way round. And I've worked in forensic wards, now called secure care, for many years as an art psychotherapist, working at Northgate Hospital, where the Sycamore unit is going to be. And as I draw to a conclusion, I just want to tell you a quick and simple story about a man who I'm going to call Stuart. Now, Stuart was actually quite complex because he'd had been imprisoned for very serious crimes. He had been in a high secure hospital, and then he moved to a medium secure hospital where I met him. And he was articulate and he was able to express himself in words, and he'd worked in the past and he had had a family. So I'm not going to pretend Stuart was not a very likeable person. He was considered to be oppositional and antagonistic and challenging and distrusting, and he didn't trust me. And he thought the idea of doing drawing and making art in therapy was a complete waste of time. And he couldn't see the point at all of doing anything with pens and pencils. And he thought it was really childish, and it reminded him of school, and that wasn't a period of his life he wanted to be reminded of. But strangely, and I'm not sure why, he did agree to work with me. And I sat down with him, and I put some pens and pencils and paper on the table, and he picked one up. And he drew a swirl on one of the pieces of paper, and he told me, "That's a black hole. That's how I feel." And then he drew a picture of a wall, the bricks, all the bricks, on one side of a piece of paper. And there was a blank bit on the other. And he said, "That's the hospital walls. And I don't think I'm going to get out." He was feeling hopeless. And he said, "I don't think I'm going to move on or make any progress." When I brought that picture back to him and I showed it to him, and we looked at the wall and that blank space, he then picked up a pen and he drew a table and chairs in that blank space. And he said, that's the meeting room. That's where he would meet his clinical team and have a chat. And he started to listen to them, and he started to trust a little bit more. And he made progress. And he moved on. And at the end of therapy, after he'd initially protested at the idea of drawing, he said, "You know, Simon, when you draw it on a piece of paper, it makes a lot more sense than what it is in your head." And he understood something about himself. And I know this because I have published the results of Stuart's therapy in a systematic single case study, that his perception of himself and his perception of others changed during art therapy, and he was more trusting and less antagonistic and less verbally aggressive to those around him. And because of this, he moved on. And this is the third and final point I would like to make about art and mental health. Art speaks to self. Now, my current work is split equally between the NHS and working at Newcastle University doing research. So the research is important because we should try to know that we're doing good in the world. Do no harm should always be our starting point. And from lessons learned from Stuart and many other research participants in art therapy, we've developed something called interpersonal art psychotherapy, and we have a randomized control trial running at the moment across 7 secure care sites in the UK and Scotland. And what we're trying to do in the SCHEMA trial, Secure Care Hospital Evaluation of Interpersonal Art Psychotherapy, is to see if this approach can help be accessible to people with communication problems. Because unfortunately, we know that people with learning difficulties broadly are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and secure care. So, to draw to a close, I'd like to thank you for your attention tonight when we've met Henry Hawkins and acknowledged him as the founder of Together for Mental Wellbeing. And it's fantastic to see those values, that advocacy that he had then demonstrated in the organisation today. And I'd like to thank you for walking with me a little bit along some of those old institutional corridors where some people experience powerlessness, and we should never forget that. And I just wonder, I wonder if you now might agree with me a little bit about my 3 points on art and mental health. That art speaks to silence, because finding your voice is important. And art speaks to shared experience, because connecting with others around us and not feeling totally alone can help. And art speaks to self, because finding meaning for ourselves can be the thing that gives us hope. Thank you very much.